The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 3 opened just after 9 in the morning, and people began to file in. Families of victims, reporters, and curious onlookers filled every seat, their faces tense with expectation. Everyone knew this would not be an ordinary sentencing hearing. At the center of it all was Judge Robert Boyd, a man whose reputation stretched far beyond the courthouse walls. For 3 decades, he had presided over some of the toughest cases in the state, known for his fairness but also for his refusal to bend when faced with intimidation or power. The defendants were escorted into the courtroom by federal marshals, their wrists and ankles shackled. These were not petty criminals. They were the leaders of a violent criminal network responsible for murders, drug trafficking, extortion, and years of terror across communities. Their names had dominated headlines, their reach extending into politics and business through corruption and fear. But today, they were prisoners in plain jumpsuits, stripped of the power they once held. The gallery stirred as they entered. Some families glared with anger, clutching photographs of loved ones. Others kept their eyes down, grief too heavy to allow even a glance at the men who had taken so much from them. A widow, in the front row, held a folded statement she intended to read, her hands trembling as she waited for her turn to speak. Judge Boyd entered the chamber and called the court to order. The charges were read aloud: conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, drug trafficking, obstruction of justice, money laundering. Years of painstaking investigation had led to this moment. The jury had already returned guilty verdicts. What remained was sentencing, the decision of how much of their lives these men would spend behind bars. The prosecution began with a review of the case. The lead prosecutor, calm but firm, outlined the sheer scope of the crimes. Charts and photographs were displayed: streets once safe, now scarred by drugs and gang violence, businesses ruined by extortion, families torn apart. Forensic evidence tied the defendants to weapons used in killings. Bank records revealed elaborate money laundering operations. Audio recordings captured chilling orders to intimidate and eliminate rivals. Each piece of evidence reinforced what the trial had already proven. These men had thrived on cruelty and fear. Victims' voices were heard through impact statements. Some were read aloud by family members present in the courtroom, others by an assistant on behalf of those too afraid to attend. One father described how his teenage son had been recruited into the drug trade, only to be murdered when he tried to leave. A shopkeeper told of threats and beatings that forced him to close his business. Each story deepened the courtroom's silence, drawing a vivid picture of destruction. The prosecution reminded the court of the intimidation tactics that had plagued the trial. Witnesses had been threatened, jurors harassed, and law enforcement officers targeted. The defendants had not only committed crimes, they had tried to erode the justice system itself. The prosecutors urged Judge Boyd to impose the harshest sentences possible, without compromise. When the defense finally spoke, the contrast was stark. Their arguments were thin, carried more by necessity than conviction. One attorney spoke of the men's troubled upbringings, pointing to poverty and hardship. Another raised the possibility of rehabilitation, arguing that life sentences without parole would eliminate hope for change. A third tried to cast doubt on the fairness of the process, suggesting that public opinion had influenced the outcome. But the arguments rang hollow. The evidence was overwhelming, and the behavior of the defendants undermined the pleas. Throughout the hearing, they sat in arrogance, smirking, shifting impatiently, refusing to acknowledge the pain in the gallery behind them. They showed no remorse, no sign of responsibility for the devastation they had caused. The families watched closely. Some shook their heads at the defense's attempts, others glared at the men who had destroyed their lives. The widow in the front row gripped her folded paper but chose not to read it aloud. The weight of her loss needed no words. When the defense rested, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Everyone knew the moment had come. Judge Boyd leaned forward, his expression calm but grave. He reviewed the arguments, acknowledging the hardships raised by the defense. Poverty and broken homes could shape lives, he said, But they did not excuse deliberate choices to commit violence and spread fear. Countless others had risen from the same conditions without resorting to cruelty. He spoke of rehabilitation, but made clear that nothing in the defendants' conduct suggested change was possible. Their empire had been built on greed and bloodshed, their influence maintained through intimidation and corruption. Even in the courtroom, they had displayed contempt for the law. Turning to the families, Judge Boyd recognized their suffering. He acknowledged the courage it took to testify, to stand against men who had ruled their neighborhoods with violence. He made it clear that the sentences he was about to deliver were not only about punishment, but about honoring the value of the lives that had been lost. Then he delivered his decision. One by one, he sentenced each defendant to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. There would be no release, no second chance. The men who had once believed themselves untouchable would spend the rest of their lives behind prison walls. For a moment, the room was silent. Then came the reactions. Some families wept openly, the release of years of grief overwhelming them. Others embraced tightly, relief mingled with sorrow. A few nodded solemnly, satisfied that justice had been served. The defendants sat rigid, their power finally gone. Some glared, others looked away, but none could alter their fate. The marshals stepped forward, chains rattling as they prepared to escort the men out of the courtroom. Outside, reporters waited to carry the story across the state. Communities that had lived in fear for years would learn that justice had prevailed. For many, the sentences represented more than punishment. They represented a turning point, proof that the law still stood strong against corruption and violence. Inside, Judge Boyd closed the files before him. His face remained composed, his duty fulfilled. He had presided over countless cases, but this one carried special weight. It was not just about crime. It was about resilience, about the courage of ordinary people to stand against fear, and about the power of justice to outlast even the darkest forces. As the courtroom slowly emptied, the echoes of footsteps faded, but the impact of the day lingered. Judge Boyd had spoken with clarity and conviction. There had been no compromise, no hesitation, and no mercy. Justice had been delivered.